Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Daffy's Roundtable. I'm super excited for this episode. For today's episode, I'm super excited and honored to have on the one, the only Dillon Perron from the Animals at Home Network. Dillon is a leading charge in the fight to better our reptile keeping and change the way the world views our hobby. With so many people trying to shut down our hobby and industry, we need more people like Dillon making a positive impact, and that's exactly what we get into in this episode. Join us as we discuss Dillon's opinion on things like the hobby, animal welfare, conservation, and how we as hobbyists can do better. But before we do that, allow me to thank Exoterra for sponsoring this podcast and making this episode possible. Exoterra makes quality products for our pet reptiles to make them feel at home. All right, without further ado, everybody, please help me welcome Dillon Perron from the Animals at Home Network. Dillon, hello.
Hello. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Thank you very much for coming on. I'm also very excited that this episode has been a long time coming, but finally it's happening, and I'm super excited. My apologies for consistently delaying it, but like I was telling you before, I wanted to kind of craft the perfect questions to ask you, and I hope, I don't think I did, but I hope I did them justice. So we'll see how this episode goes, but I'm super excited to have you on regardless. Before we get into who is Dillon Perron, I was doing some digging and found out that you actually grew up on an emu farm.
Yes. Yeah, I did. So I like, every animal person doesn't really know why they're an animal person, but I think a lot of times it has to do with your parental influence. And my dad grew up on a farm his whole life. He's been surrounded by animals, and I wouldn't consider him to be. He's not like a hobbyist like we are, where we're tinkering with animals like this, but he's somebody that will go out, like he has horses and chickens now. He's always had animals surrounding him. So when we were, I don't know, I must have been 5 or 6, he decided it would be a good idea to start an emu farm. Nice. And this would have been, late 90s, mid 90s type thing. And yeah, so I think he just started with a few and eventually grew to quite a substantial farm. I mean, hundreds of birds for sure. And so that's part of my upbringing, was living in, it's very similar to any other farm, a sheep farm, a cattle farm, except for instead of the typical farmyard animals, you have these giant birds roaming your yard. So yeah.
Were you able to like kind of interact with them? I don't know how old you were at the time, but like, were you able to were you the one kind of getting involved, feeding them, doing all that kind of stuff?
It's sort of like I was pretty young. This would probably been from the ages of maybe like 6 to 10, something like that. So the thing with emus is they're quite large. And now in my memory, they're huge. And now when I go to the zoo, I realize that they're not nearly as big as I remember. But obviously I was quite small. But they are quite dangerous, especially to a small child. They're like, their talons on their feet are pretty aggressive. My dad would come back with like ripped clothes and whatnot. And they would. So you would interact them in some capacity. I mean, they would come like grab your hat, like they'd pull the bill of your hat right off, but we would interact with the chicks for sure. The chicks were obviously quite small and cute, and so my brother and I could feed those. It was very a rare occurrence where we'd be in the main enclosures, not enclosures, I mean the penned area with them. But yeah, you're definitely interacting with them. You hear them. I mean, for those people that don't know, the males kind of make like this grunting sound, and the females have this like real deep. It's like a bass kind of drum sound. So even though they were fairly far from our actual house, you could be sitting in the living room and you would hear this like thumping coming through the walls. And yeah, so I mean, looking back on it, it's quite bizarre. At the time, it was very normal, Yeah, emus. It's interesting.
It's fascinating. I've never really, like you said, I've only ever seen them at the zoo, but like I can't imagine waking up and like just opening my back window or my backyard and there's an emu right there.
Yeah.
That is awesome. That is awesome. Okay, so we know that you kind of grew up on an emu farm for a little bit at least. What's the story after that? How'd you get involved in reptiles? Who is Dillon Perron?
Well, like I said, I've always been an animal person. I mean, if you had asked me as a 10-year-old what I wanted to be when I grew up, the answer would have been a scientist. And, as far as I was concerned, that meant somebody who researched animals. So we'd always had pets, rats, fish and whatnot. But growing up in a farm, especially because my dad still lives on this property, we have an in-ground pool there. And even though we have short summers in Manitoba, one of the fun things that my brother and I would do in the mornings after a rainfall is collect all the frogs off the tarp, or the ones that would fall into the pool. And so there's always an interaction with at least herpetofauna in some capacity. And being in Manitoba, there's not a lot of reptile wildlife out here. I mean, there are garter snakes, red-sided garter snakes. And in Manitoba, we do have the largest breeding den, which I've never been to. So it's kind of I shouldn't even talk about it because it's a crime that I haven't been there. But being here, you see garter snakes all over the place. So there would be kind of some early interactions with just wild native, the native wildlife on the landscape. But as far as actually keeping reptiles, that really didn't start till much later. I was, how old? I was about 15. That's probably when I initially got in. That's when I got my first crested gecko. He's still right behind me. You know, I've had the same crested gecko since 2007. So it's that is when I initially got into it. And then even then, there was quite a lag before I actually jumped into the hobby. I wouldn't call myself a hobbyist with the one gecko, only because I wasn't interacting with. I'm not saying that if you only have one reptile, you're not a hobbyist. I think the definition of a hobbyist in my mind is someone who interacts with other hobbyists and other people, and you're learning from each other rather than just being like in a silo, essentially. So that's what I was for a long time. But yeah, so that's getting a crested gecko was my intro, but the hobby came much later for me. And the reason I got a crested gecko is because I think I've told this story before. I went to Safeway, which is a grocery store here in Canada, although they're slowly diminishing down into Sobeys, I guess. But they had these Venus flytraps for sale as like the kind of the impulse purchase at the till. And I picked one up because I thought that was so cool. I'd never seen one in person before. I thought that was so interesting, and went home and researched and realized that to take care of it effectively, you need to put it in some sort of terrarium to hold humidity. Obviously, they're a Carolina species used to high humidities. Manitoba has very little humidity. Even in the summer, it's okay, but it's nothing. In the winter, it's dry. So I started building this kind of vivarium thing out. And then at the end of the article, I was this is like a long time ago, so the internet was not very fleshed out at this point as far as reptile information. But I just remember at the end of the article, it basically said, once you've built your terrarium, you could consider adding a small gecko or lizard or frog into it. And then that's what sent me off into the path of, okay, I really want to get something. And so the Venus flytrap died, obviously, because who knows how to care for those at that time. And but then, that sent me down the path of looking for a reptile to buy. And eventually that's where the crested gecko came in.
That is awesome. Yeah, I was about to ask you, were you able to keep that Venus flytrap alive? Because I've bought like 600 of them over the years, and not a single one has survived.
Yeah.
But that is awesome, man. Yeah, I also started with the crested gecko, by the way, and he's still around. I think they're a good first introduction into reptile keeping, and I think, not that we agree with. Actually, this is a good question to bring up. Not that I think there is a specific perfect beginner reptile, but I do think that if there was, I think crested geckos would be one of them, and solely because of the whole like rapacious and lack of care. I think it takes people a while to get into like being able to do feeder insects and whatnot. But on that topic, and then we'll jump back to the story. Do you think that there's a perfect beginner reptile, or do you think that with research, many different things can be the perfect beginner reptile?
I think it really depends on the person. I would agree that crested geckos do make for a very good first pet. I mean, they're robust. Like you said, the diet is fairly easy to manage. The basics are quite simple. So it's clear that there are some animals that require a much higher level of husbandry abilities in order to keep alive. That doesn't mean that someone couldn't start with a higher level husbandry. It's more like, where is your skill set? If you're somebody that's kept a reef tank, you could jump into dart frogs. But if you're never kept an animal, or like even a hamster, then a crested gecko is a great place to start. I mean, in some ways, when we think of starter species or great species to get into, it's very colored by the fact that we have this set of animals that are common in captivity. So I mean, there's so many different species of reptiles and amphibians out there, but we just it's like leopard gecko, crested gecko, bearded dragon. Those are kind of falling in, and those happen to be the ones that are very popular. They do make decent starter pets depending on who you are, but it's sometimes it's funny. Like, there might be a very perfect reptile out there that's the best starter pet possible, but we just don't keep them in captivity, so we would never know. But as far as ones that we do commonly keep, yeah, I think crested geckos are up there. And there's always the question of whether or not someone should start with a starter species before moving on to something more advanced. Again, I think it's so variable by the person. Should someone keep an animal that they don't actually have passion for just so they can get their feet wet into keeping reptiles? That's maybe not the best thing, just because are you actually going to enjoy keeping that? Or would you put all of your time and energy into that emerald tree boa that you're going to go spend $5,000 on and really make sure you understand how to care for it? So it does go down to what your goals are and the type of person you are, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a great point. Like, will it burn you out of reptile keeping right from the beginning because you picked the wrong species to keep? You know, what if you just don't enjoy keeping crested geckos, but you really enjoy keeping emerald tree boas, as you said, or whatever?
Exactly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Excellent answer. I love it. Okay, so jumping back to the Dillon Perron story, when did you start to get involved in the hobby, and when did you decide to start the YouTube channel? And I guess that's what sort of progressed into the podcast, right?
Yeah, basically, exactly. So I kept Jackson, my crested gecko, for a long time, and I swam with. For those that don't know, my life is my other side of my life is swimming involved. That's where most of my time and energy goes into. I was an athlete for a long time, and at the time I was training with a girl who still actually now I have the opportunity to coach. She's one of the best swimmers in the country. She's been to the Olympics and potentially, hopefully, this Paris as well to go to the Olympics. Anyway, she's also and she's a reptile keeper as well. She has chameleons now and all these things. So she kind of is on our side with that. We always reptile people are always a little bit weird, right? So we kind of connected immediately, and she had a few animals, and when she would go away. I think she just had like one crested gecko even. When she would go away on some of these like national swimming trips, she would ask me to watch her geckos or gecko. And then at the time, I only had my crested gecko, but bringing her gecko into my home really made me realize how easy it was to care for too. Like, it was no extra work, which is the danger of the reptile hobby, right? Because,
Yes.
one's pretty easy, two's pretty easy, three's easy. And then suddenly it's like, okay, now I have 20, and now it's not as easy because you're doing a 5-second task 20 times, whatever it is. But that's what really made me think I should get another one. I think it would be fascinating. So anyway, that's what got me into my second animal, which was a giant day gecko, and who actually just passed away last year. She was kind of old and sickly, so I think I had her for 10-ish years. No, yeah, just under 10 years. She was maybe like 13 or 14. I bought her as an adult, and I had done this giant vivarium for her and building out this thing that was designed for a day gecko. But being in Canada, as you know, things aren't as easy to come across. I mean, the way where you are, you're going to be exposed to a lot more variety of species than where I am. And I just found that it was like impossible to find a day gecko. So then that's what made me start realizing, okay, I have this vivarium that's like ready to go for something. But I don't have the species that I want to get. So I started to investigate other potential species and going on forums and posting the thing and saying, hey, what do you guys think? What could potentially go in here? And I would say that was my introduction to the hobby, because now I'm speaking with hobbyists and getting opinions and going back and forth. And long story short, I ended up finding a day gecko at our local expo and buying her, but I now had this thing ticking in my head, like other things that I might want to get as well because of these conversations I was having on the forums. And that's what really got me into keeping snakes. So it wasn't long after I bought my first boa, and then, my collection hasn't snowballed like crazy. I only have the 5 or 6 animals. So, but that's really what got me into it. And then as far as getting into the online space, I had just retired from swimming. I retired from swimming in 2016 as an athlete. And so it was the following summer, and training at a fairly high level, racing at a national level, you spend 25 hours a week training. It's just a lot, and I needed something to do. Like once I was done with that, it was a very big hole in my life. I needed to fill it in some capacity, and I did want to experiment trying to come up with a way to make a side income as well. At the time I was coaching, I still coach swimming now, but it wasn't really a full income. So I thought, if I can coach and have a passion there, even though it's not paying my full paycheck, can I supplement it in some other way with another passion of mine, which would be reptiles? And actually, I started doing like building out websites for things that I'm not interested in at all, attempting to like try to make money. And it was like I was doing like nutrition things, and I kind of forget at this point. But what I quickly realized is, if you're not working on something you're passionate about, you have zero motivation. So I would wake up and I would like drag myself to the computer and like try to write these like terrible blog posts. I'm like, what the hell am I doing? So then I turned around and looked at all these animals behind me and thought, why don't I just do a blog about reptiles? And at the very least, I will enjoy the work. And whether it makes money in the end is one thing, but at least I can attempt to see if this is something I can do. So actually, Animals at Home did really kind of start as a blog originally. Like, I was writing kind of some care sheets, and I barely remember at this point what else I would write. Mostly kind of care-oriented things, but I quickly started doing DIY projects as well. and documenting those. And then that's where YouTube got folded in, because I thought, well, if I'm going to write these articles, I might as well film it. So I would film a video and then write an article about it. I was doing a tremendous amount of work for like very little, but it got my feet in the door, you know. And I did that for probably like maybe 8 months, just doing various videos or DIY projects, building like little tinkering with things and whatnot in the reptile room. And then I realized this would have been like 2018. So the pet tube spike has really kind of taken off at this point. You have the big names that are like making huge amounts of views and whatnot. And I realized that was not me. I was not going to be the, hey guys, welcome to my reptile room. Like, here's my next animal that I got. Like, nothing against those people. I just knew that wasn't going to be me. I lived in an apartment at the time. I didn't have space to continuously add animals and create this crazy reptile room. And so that is when the podcast came to my mind. I thought maybe if I interview people, then I don't have to pretend to be an expert. I think that's a common mistake people make when they start YouTube, is you feel like because you're trying to create this audience that you have to that you're trying to fake being an expert, and it just didn't feel right. So I thought, well, I can at least talk to experts, and then I can learn, and the listeners and the viewers can watch me learn about these things, and it can be kind of a journey together. So that was the original idea. And then I thought, well, that also feeds content. It can create regular content without having to go out and buy animals and do unboxings and whatnot. And yeah, so that was kind of the genesis of the idea back in the fall of 2018, and it started then, and I just basically haven't stopped. And yeah, so it brings us to year 6 and 200 episodes later, and yeah, it's been kind of a crazy journey.
That's awesome. Congratulations on 200 episodes, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah, that is awesome. Why animals at home? Why not reptiles at home?
Well, this is part of my own self-consciousness of thinking, like, if I'm going to write this blog, and at the time, you have to remember the animals at home came from the blog idea. It had nothing to do with the podcast or even a YouTube channel, and I just was trying to come up with something to do with my time. So I thought reptiles, even though I have reptiles, that's all I had at the time. It's still all I have. Oh, I guess I have some inverts as well now. But I thought that's just too small of a market. That's just too small. Like, I'm going to run out of things to write about if I just write about reptiles. I was incredibly wrong about that. So that's why animals at home, I thought I would make it more general. And in the back of my head, I used to keep fish, and I always thought I would get back into keeping fish at some point. So I wanted to kind of leave that door open for myself. But mainly it was because I really thought that you couldn't fill enough content about just reptiles, and yeah, definitely a wrong thing. But at the same time, animals at home has a nice little ring to it at this point. It does leave the door open if I do want to branch out at some point, but it was more of an insecurity than anything.
It's funny, I asked because I went the other way, and I went with Daffy's Reptiles, and and everything you left the door open for was definitely a good idea, because now I'm like, oh, I want to do a video on, because I also work with fish and inverts and all that kind of stuff now. I want to do but it's Daffy's, which I'm doing it anyway, but it does feel like, will people even discover it because it's reptiles, or will it not? But yeah, no, that's awesome. And I also love that the whole idea of like, I'm not an expert, I'm interviewing experts, and I'm learning, and you're learning, and you guys are learning with me, because it's how I feel exactly about this podcast as well. It's a very good way to like kind of look at it. Okay, so you've been doing this for a very long time. What are like some of the important things in the hobby that you think, like, if there's a need for change everywhere, right? But what if you could pinpoint a few things that you think like, these are the first things we need to change, these are the important things? What are some of the things you would like kind of point out?
Well, I think one of the things, and I don't even know how you fix this, and I don't know necessarily if it's a problem per se, but it is hard to look at reptile keeping without getting the full blast message in your face that it's mostly about the keeper enjoying keeping the animals. And I'm not saying there's nothing wrong with that, but if that is your starting place and your finishing place, we run into a lot of problems. So if it's completely a selfish endeavor, it's an issue. And I would never say that reptile keeping isn't selfish in some way. Of course it is. There's parts about reptile keeping that is all for you as the keeper, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's a highly interesting and intriguing and challenging, and you learn a lot. It's very rewarding in many ways. So there is a selfish part. There's nothing wrong with being selfish. Eating a meal could be considered selfish. You have to live, but there's nothing wrong per se with that. But if you don't extend it beyond, in my opinion, to the animals as well, we run into problems. And I think that is some of the big areas we've kind of hit the ditch with herpetoculture over the past 20 years. Is it has just become, not everywhere, but there's been segments of our hobby that it is just about the interest that the person has and what they're doing with the animal. And it's very obvious that the animals are not, in some ways, not even playing second fiddle to that. They're not even considered in that. You can hear it when people talk about the animal itself. They're telling you about the characteristics that animal carries or what's interesting about the species, but they're not actually telling you about the specific animal that's in their hand, which I think is a danger, because we wouldn't do that. Well, some people would, but we typically wouldn't do that with dogs or cats. We want to respect each individual within the hobby as an individual, and it's not a woo-woo thing, like a spiritual thing. It's each animal in our care is they don't have the choice to be there, and I think there's a huge argument to be made that increasing the welfare of each animal in our collection is a positive thing, and it's not even positive for just the animal, it's also positive for the keeper. But I would say if we can somehow shift the focus to go back to the animal first, I think that is really a crucial aspect to keeping the hobby healthy and functioning, because anybody that looks to the hobby from an outsider perspective, that's all they see as well. Like if you just see a room of racks, you don't see somebody who's very passionate about each individual animal. That person could be passionate about each individual animal, but it's not the optic, that's not what we see when we look into it. And I think the more we can do to promote the message that we actually do care about every individual, it would do a lot for helping our hobby grow and thrive.
Yeah, no, that's 100%. So is there something that you would encourage people to, is there like a philosophy that you would share or something that you would encourage people to do to kind of start on this path?
I think the easiest way is you have to be very aware of the way a human brain works. And we thrive off dopamine. And dopamine feels good, especially if you're somebody who falls into the ADD category, ADHD. You are somebody who's, and then there's a lot of us in this hobby because it sort of caters to that. You're somebody who's addicted to dopamine, and you're going to be chasing those dopamine spikes. And the easiest way to get a massive dopamine hit in our hobby is by purchasing a new animal. And it's not by actually getting a new animal. It's the purchase and then the anticipation of getting that animal. And everybody knows what I'm talking about. It's the exact same mechanism that works for slot machines. It's not the reward you get. It's the anticipation of watching the thing spin until you figure out if you've won or not. That's where the dopamine kicks in. And so we have to be very aware that there's a framework in our brain that's millions of years old that is for striving towards producing dopamine. And if we let that take control, you end up chasing dopamine over and over and over again. And like I said, the easiest way to do that is continuously purchasing an animal after another animal and another animal. And then you end up in a situation where you're overwhelmed. So that's the first thing. Pay attention to what your brain's doing. Do I actually want this animal, or is it just a need to, fulfill this dopamine spike? And then the best part is you can actually induce a dopamine spike through improving the home or the care of an animal that you currently have. And everybody knows that once you start working on a new enclosure, maybe you have new ideas. I'm going to put new lighting here. I'm going to actually tear this down completely and get new branches. That is as fun as getting a new animal. But if you don't actually go down that path, then you just get the new animal and you realize that like I said, the snowball starts. But you can, in some ways, thwart or redirect that wanting to do something new with the current animals you have rather than having to buy new animals.
Yeah, I agree. And especially that feeling of, like you said, I'm going to put that branch here, I'm going to put that light here, and then seeing the animal perch on that branch right under the light, and you're like, I nailed it. That's also an incredible feeling. So maybe more people just need to get hooked onto that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So on that, would you like to see the reptile hobby grow and have more people keeping reptiles, or do you think that the more we expand, the more detrimental it could be for reptiles and conservations? Like, where do you lie on the hobby growing as a whole?
I think the hobby growing is not a bad thing. I think as long as we are promoting it in the right way and that you're recruiting new keepers for the right reasons, like recruiting somebody to get into reptiles because it's a get rich quick scheme.
Yeah.
that's not a good reason. And we had a lot of that, especially in
And
the 2000s.
nor is it true.
And it's not true. Yeah. That's the other side thing. Turns out business is hard. You can't just buy snakes and make them print money. And so that's a bad reason for people to get into animals. But if we can do it because it's promoting science and, you know, a fascination with animals in general, and just allowing people to connect with nature in a way that's becoming more and more difficult as we live in these more urban environments, those are the people we want in the hobby, and that's not a bad thing. I think the more ubiquitous the hobby becomes, the less, you know, we're always under threat with the legislation and you know, AR groups and whatnot. The more widespread reptile keeping becomes, I think it does create a safeguard. Now, we do have to be careful that we're not being hypocritical and growing the hobby at the expense of the natural world, which is another thing that we do sometimes. It's like, I want to be around nature, so I'm going to go decimate nature. Well, that's not a great idea. The idea better, you know, the better idea is to have captive breeding and make sure that we're supporting captive breeding operations within our hobby. And when wild-caught animals come in, they go to the specialized people who are working with those. But even more important, I think, is if it could be more of a norm for keepers to somehow support conservation in some capacity, and you don't support conservation by keeping the species in your bedroom. I know that's something that we like. I call it the bumper sticker thing, like keeping for conservation. You have some snakes in your bedroom. You're not a conservationist. It's cool, and I have snakes in my room as well. But that's not conservation. Conservation is somehow sending money off to the organizations that are boots on the ground doing conservation. And I think we're starting to see a lot more of that. Like, you'll see brands and companies that when you check out of their store online, you'll start seeing donation options for certain things. If that culture can continue to expand and we can find certain conservation organizations that really gel with our message and with our hobby in general, the people within our hobby, I just imagine how much we could do as far as, like, you know, creating extra cash flow. If every dollar of every purchase went to some conservation in some capacity, I think that would be absolutely massive. Yeah,
that's huge. Okay, so much to go off of that. Okay, so before we jump back to the people in conservation, I was asked this by Paul's Monitors on his podcast the other day. I'm going to steal the question from him. Thank you, Paul.
Sure.
And I'm going to ask it to you. If you had the power to stop wild imports, like right now, would you do it or not? And why?
That is a tough question. I mean, there's so many facets to wild-caught markets. Now, again, it would be dependent on the species. So are we talking about species that are near threatened and that we're decimating the wild population to basically non-existence? I would want to pull the plug on immediately. Is it a species where there is an abundance in nature and it's actually creating some form of economy for the people that are local? Because that's another thing that you have to think about, is that there are people who make money off of collecting hermit crabs off the beach, you know, and it's not a good industry for that animal, but the person that's collecting it, you know, they're using that money to feed their family. So who are we to say stop collecting those crabs, those crustaceans, and just go starve? You know, that doesn't seem very fair either. So I think there's definitely always going to be some room and some reason to have wild. It's the same as hunting. I mean, we hunt and we manage the populations of the animals that we hunt, and I don't think anybody's going to, well, I'm sure some people would, but most people won't argue that hunting is decimating wild populations. We've had histories of hunting decimating, you know, look at the bison in North America and whatnot. But as long as it's being managed and properly looked after, I don't think there's any reason that it's a bad thing. There are many reasons, like Chinese water dragons. Do we need wild-caught Chinese water dragons with fungal infections in their eyes to go home with a 10-year-old on their birthday from PetSmart to die 3 days later? That is a waste of a life. But can we bring in wild-caught blood to continue working with a preservation mindset? That's not a bad thing. Can we stimulate some economies in local communities with animals that are in abundance? Maybe they're even considered a pest and they're going to be killed anyway. Those are situations where I think continuing a wild-caught market is not a bad thing.
Awesome. And then on that, like you said, not to jump off the bumper sticker thing, one of the other common things is not just I have snakes in my bedroom, is, oh, I'm breeding this species, and so I'm helping by me breeding the species, people will likely bring in less wild-caught animals. Do you think this is true, or what's your opinion on that statement? Yeah.
I mean, I guess in some capacity it probably is true. Like you technically probably are alleviating that wild market in some way, but it's I would not consider that conservation. I think it's just too big of a dent. I mean, the biggest issues with conservation are wildlife or the landscape destruction, right? Like cutting down trees, destroying the rainforest, and for urban centers or whatever it is. So yeah, does adding some captive bred animals into the market reduce the need for wild caught? Yes. Is it a huge reason for can you consider yourself a massive conservationist by doing that? I don't think so. I think if you actually sent money to the organizations, like I said, who are actually owning the property and the ground that is being protected, that's a lot more effective way to actually conserve, because that's what conserve means, right? You're trying to make something that's there not go away. So creating captive bred, yes, hopefully that doesn't contribute to more wild caught animals being pulled off of the natural landscape, but I think at the end of the day, it does come down to protecting what's there, protecting the land, especially.
Yeah, 100%. And so you've already mentioned, sending money to the conservationists out there, the people actually doing the work out there. Maybe a percentage of what you're making off the animals you're selling or whatever it is. Do you have any other ideas of some ways that people can get involved and help with conservation as hobbyists?
Well, I think that's a big one. Is just finding an organization that you trust and that you think is working in an area. If you're a Madagascar person, you keep animals from Madagascar, you can go find conservationists or a conservation organization that's working in those areas. Can you donate $5 a month to a charity like that? I mean, that is nothing for us in North America. It's like I'm holding a Starbucks coffee right here. This probably cost me $5. I didn't even look at it's probably $5 right there. And that's like, people are going to do that sometimes on a daily basis. So those little things actually do add up. If you're somebody who's breeding an animal from a specific area, I think it's a great idea to just increase the price of that animal by $5 or $10, and even tell your buyers that, hey, yeah, this is normally $200, it's now $220, $20 is being donated to X conservation, because those types of things I think do go a long way, and most people are actually happy to support that. If you are just maybe you're a person who doesn't have the means to donate, then that's where you want to really make sure that you're buying from a ethically bred breeder, whether that's you want to be looking at a captive bred situation. I think there are many ways people can get involved. Or, not to plug my own thing, but if you're watching animals at home on YouTube, you know that I do make donations on a quarterly basis based off of the YouTube revenues and the Amazon revenues, as well as when people buy shirts and whatnot. So I do make donations that way. So, and I would love to see more creators do that as well, where you just take a small percentage, whether it's 5, 10, or even 2%, whatever it is, and just shuffle it off to an organization that you like. Then people who aren't using ad blockers, who are watching your content, and maybe because they don't have the money to send, they can at least contribute in that way as well.
Yeah, no, that's an incredible idea. I do hope more creators start to do that as well. I am absolutely inspired right now, and so I'm going to look into doing something like this. So I don't have any merch or anything out at the moment or anything like that. But stay tuned, people. We will do something for conservation very, very soon. Okay, so there's a bit of a heavy conversation. Maybe we'll jump to a bit of a lighter topic for a second.
Sure.
Your carpet python enclosure is beautiful. I love it. I also keep carpet pythons, and I'm looking to upgrade them and kind of build that kind of thing. So here's some questions on carpet python enclosures. You build it yourself?
So these are custom reptile habitat enclosures. So they come to me flat packed. That's one of my sponsors, and anybody can look them up. It's they're, I think, one of the best reptile enclosure brands out there. They're a premium brand, so they come with a price tag, but they're very high quality. So Paul from Custom Reptile Habitat sent that to me. So yeah, I tacked it together, but the actual enclosure is something that you just
okay. Yeah, I don't know. I thought I saw somewhere that you built it yourself. Maybe that was a previous enclosure or something.
It could have been. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. You might have been looking at the previous carpet python enclosure. Yeah, that one I did build out of some glass windows.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Well, I was gonna ask you, do you build a lot of your enclosures? But I guess from the look of them, they all look like custom reptile.
Yeah. I used to, and actually, this one right here, it doesn't look like enclosure. It's empty. But that's what my carpet python was, and that's the one that I did make. And right now, it's just holding some tarantulas, and it doesn't have a screen top. That's what my Japanese rat snake will go into later this summer once I add a top to it, obviously. It needs
Nice.
a
Yeah,
top,
yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
They will definitely escape without a top.
yeah, that's what I know for sure.
How is you must have something on top of it so the tarantula doesn't get out though, right?
Oh, the tarantula enclosures are just sitting inside there.
Sitting inside. Okay, okay.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. That makes sense.
But yeah,
Okay.
I used to make all my own enclosures. I would convert like shelves and whatnot into for enclosures for my boas, and I still think it's a great way to go. I don't know how much money it actually saves, especially in our market now. I mean, when you go to the hardware store, you leave and you're like, that was $800. I just bought some like wood, and
Yeah.
but so I always say to people, if you're trying to save money and you're handy, you could make DIY is great, and it's a really fun project if you have the summer off and you want to build some enclosures. I mean, look at like Tanner from Serpa Design. You can follow these people who are doing these types of things. If you're someone who's not very handy and you're trying to like figure out if it makes sense, it probably doesn't, because you're gonna have to buy tools. You have to learn what you're doing. You're gonna mess up to the point where you're gonna lose materials and that sort of thing. But I always enjoyed building my own enclosures as well. I think it is really fun. And I even did mine in like my apartment, like my living room. Made a lot of mess, but could pull it off.
Yeah, I'm horrible at doing that kind of thing. I don't try to, like, I'm definitely team like just go like maybe you buy a used enclosure if you need to save some money, but
Exactly.
I'm team buy enclosure because I always find a way to mess something up. So I'm just like this is the easiest way to do it. But awesome. So okay, so your carpet python has incredible yellows on it. Has it always had these yellows? And this is me just asking for personal reasons right now.
Yeah, it's funny because I remember finding a video a long time ago before I even had snakes, and it was a guy actually converting a cupboard in Australia into a carpet python enclosure, and he had these jungle carpet pythons, and I just remember seeing this incredibly like stark yellow and black and just loving that animal. And then so for a long time I knew I would want to eventually get a jungle carpet python. So I wish I knew. He came from Ontario. Both his mom and dad were fairly high yellow as well. And that's where the funny part about people who are like totally anti-morph, yet like, yeah, my carpet python is striking, and he is striking really from like line breeding, creating more and more yellows. If you look at wild type jungle carpet pythons, it's a lot more of like a gold rather than like a fluorescent
Like
yellow.
Yellow, yeah.
Yeah, so it's something that's been worked on over years. So it I really should have looked up who I got him from. I'm not even sure this breeder's in the business anymore, but yeah, so he kind of came from like a higher yellow line, and yeah, he when you first get a carpet python, obviously they're more drab, they're gray and kind of reddish type thing, but with every shed it gets brighter and brighter, and yeah, he's stunning.
Yeah, he definitely is. Well, I saw the picture you posted the other day, and I was shocked because I also got it from like a reputable breeder here in Ottawa. And I was told it was going to be like high end line, and it was, as you're saying, it was pretty drab. And we're like 4 years in, and I'm like, "Where's the yellows, man?" It's I mean, he's beautiful. I love him very much, but he's turned out more of like almost a white and black than
Okay,
yellow and
interesting.
black. Yeah, so I was just curious about that. Does your carpet python spend a lot of time in the water?
I haven't seen him in the water very much. Does yours?
Yeah, one of mine does. The other one
Interesting.
doesn't. Yeah,
So that's where the personality things come in, right? Every animal's a little bit different, and unless he does it at nighttime when I'm not down here, I've not seen him really in the water ever.
yeah. Okay, so you and the other species of snake. I forgot how to speak. The other species of snake you keep is a boa BCI.
Yeah. So I have two BCIs, and one is kind of like a hybrid. He's half Sonoran desert boa, half boa imperator in some capacity. Who knows what their bloodlines are at this point? But so I have two boas, and then I have a Brazilian rainbow boa as well, and a Japanese rat snake, like I had mentioned earlier.
Okay, awesome. So are your well, I should take a step back first and say, is your carpet python active and is always kind of roaming around the enclosure?
He is quite active. I mean, he's typically much more active kind of dusk, dawn, and at nighttime. During the day, he will be a little bit active. I'm just checking what he's doing right now. He's sleeping, but he's always out basking. That's what makes him such a good like showpiece, if you want to call it that, is because typically during the day I'll find him under the heat lamp just relaxing, and then he'll make his way around. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, he's out quite often.
Awesome. And then in comparison to the BCIs, are they also this active, or are they kind of more like lazier snakes that just kind of
Yeah, they're a little more lazy. I mean, my female, who's kind of my largest snake, she, I would say like once a month wants out of her enclosure type thing to go like cruise around the basement. So she'll sort of let me know that by pacing a little bit. So I'll slide open the doors and let her roam around. But once she's done that for a couple hours, I just this is a good tip for anybody. You let your snakes out, set a timer on your phone that repeats every 20 minutes, because you'd be amazed at how you're just like watching TV like 3 hours later. You're like, oh my God, how long has the snake been out? But yeah, so once she does that, she'll go back in and she'll be pretty kind of like quote unquote lazy. Like I said, every snake's a little bit different. My rainbow boa is extremely nocturnal. I literally rarely see her because she only comes out like the middle of the night, and I am not a night person. I go to bed relatively early, but I wake up really early. So that's the only time I do see her is when a couple times a week I'm up at about 4. I'll come down and she's out. But other than that, I don't see her very much. But they're all great animals. I mean, I think like you said, you have to sort of know what you're getting. If you're someone that doesn't stay up at nighttime, getting a nocturnal species, you just end up looking at an enclosure all day. So that's something that you have to take in consideration. But I think the boas make great pets, especially my male, because he's so small and he is this kind of like hybrid. So he's only like 5 feet, and he's already he's 9 years old, so he's not going to grow any more than that. Pretty much, well, he will, but not substantially. And it's just one of those really calm, slow moving snakes. And the perfect type of snake that you can put on the ground and they're not going to skitter off into the corner and then lose them type thing.
Yeah. So you kind of just answered the question I was going to ask, which is like, do you and this is definitely like a human personality thing, and everyone prefers different things. Or I guess not personality, human taste. But what's your opinion on kind of keeping calmer, slower species that kind of don't move around much, like for example a ball python, versus colubrids, or even like my carpet pythons are always on the move as well. I don't know, like mostly at night, but even during the day, like they'll bask and then a couple hours later find them basking in another spot, and they kind of move around a lot. So what's your preference now that you keep both, and what's your opinion?
Yeah, I really love slow snakes. I know that's not for everybody. One of the things that's nice about slow snakes is they don't immediately make you feel like they're in an enclosure that's too small, and that all my enclosures are fairly large, 6 feet by 3 feet tall, and especially my male, it suits him perfectly. But if you have a real fast moving snake and they're pacing, all you can think about is, wow, how much space does this animal actually need? How fast would they go? How far would they go? And they're a perfect snake for people who are uncomfortable with snakes because they don't do anything unpredictable for the most part, especially a calm boa. Or a ball python doesn't get better than that as far as like plopping a snake in someone's hands or allowing them to watch it move around on the floor. That snake's not going to move its way across the living room at any speed. Where the colubrids are very fast. It's actually shocking how fast they can move. My rat snake is still pretty small, but he's insanely fast, and he's a little bit. They seem to, at least that species, seems to see very well. So like real big eyes, dilated pupils from across the room. He's like zoop into his hide, where the boas, like you come right up to them and either they don't care or they don't really see you until you're kind of up in their face, and they're not intimidated by you. So I think if you're somebody who's not confident with snakes, going with a slower species is just so much better.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, so here's another, maybe we'll jump back to a bit of a heavier topic again. You keep mostly, I mean, I guess you did say you have two boas, but they're kind of different species or different hybrids or different morphs or whatever. Not morphs. Anyway, the question is, do you seem to prefer to keep individual species and not have an interest in breeding? Is there a reason for that, or is it just a time focused thing?
Yeah, there's definitely a reason for it. I mean, when I first got into keeping boas, I knew nothing about boas, so it was a classic, like, just get into boas. I loved the way a boa looked, and I found this boa for sale, and I'm trying to remember what it was labeled as. It was something bizarre, like an orange pastel leopard boa, which it is neither of those things. I mean, I think there's potentially het leopard, but I think I bought him as like a leopard boa, and I was like, I don't know what that is, but it sounds pretty cool. So for those that don't know, leopard is a morph that's found in boas, and it's like I think it's really only in the Sonoran Desert boa kind of bloodline. He is half Sonoran Desert, probably half Colombian boa, so it's theoretically possible that he is a het for leopard, but he just looks like a regular boa. And so when I bought him originally, I ended up maybe like 3 or 4 months later, I ended up with another boa that was kind of more of like a rescue situation. It was like for sale on Kijiji, so the Craigslist of Canada, and she was in an 18 by 18 by 24 Exoterra with like a red heat lamp. It was super dry, stuck shed everywhere. And I remember the lady telling me she fed it every day. It was like a really bizarre situation.
Wow.
And yeah, it was really weird. So I acquired that boa, and then because Manitoba is quite a small reptile keeping community, I figured out where that boa came from. And then I realized like, oh, she's het for albino. So suddenly I have this like idea of, I'm going to breed these two snakes. Like, and I had this thing of like, I could create a snow leopard, which is, I don't even know if that's existed, but it sounded super cool where I could create this leopard boa and then breed it with an actual albino and then have this snow leopard. I think because she also was potentially a carrier for anthristic. So it's been a long time since I've looked at morphs, but if you have an albino and an anery boa, you get this snow morph. So I thought if you could do that, literally it was like a 20-year project by the time you could get your way down. Like, yeah, exactly. And so I was like super cool. I was like, this is gonna be amazing. I mean, of course, it's something I wouldn't be able to start for years down the road because these animals are not sexually mature, even close. But then I would go on Kijiji and I would see this het albino boa's litter mates still for sale like an entire year later. So this litter was still for sale. And I thought, wow, that's crazy, especially because I had one of those, which was in the worst conditions ever. So not only are they not able to sell the litter, the ones that did make it out are in horrible hands. And so that's when I realized there's no way I could breed. Like, it just doesn't make sense, especially when you're dealing with boas. You could be dealing with 25, 30 babies. I don't have room for that. So that's what really kind of woke me up to that would not be a good idea. Now I would consider breeding, but I just more it's a time thing. I don't have the time or the leftover energy at the end of the day to put towards a breeding project. If I did, it would be something very small, like the stenodactyls, for example, that you work with. I think like something like that is perfect because you can sell them to people you don't have to take up an entire room to care for these animals. Those types of things are the projects that I think eventually I may get into. But even still, like, you're having to sell animals, you're having to, not negotiate, but talk to customers. And not that I have anything wrong with people. It's just, it's not a simple commitment. It's a time thing. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know that makes sense. Yeah. You should absolutely get into stenodactyls, by the way. They are awesome.
I do want to. I think they're fascinating.
In my opinion, we talked about sort of like, right at the beginning of the episode, we talked about like the perfect pet. If there was one to be classified as that, minus the fact that they do need, like, they're insectivores and you can't feed them rapashi or whatever, I think they should be. Not that I want to enforce that, there's a perfect beginner pet or anything, or not a beginner, but I think they're one of the perfect pet reptiles because they're small. As you said, you don't need an entire room. You put them in like a 20-gallon long and they're like, it's crazy how
much space that is.
Yeah, like it's a tiny gecko and like a huge, so it's incredible. They chirp, not often, so it's not annoying, but they have they make cool noises. The tail wags. You can pick them up and hold them because they're not fast. And eventually they do. You can tongue feed them, so they do get used to you as like they're incredible animals. And so on that topic, do you think more people in the hobby should be getting into looking at smaller species or desk pets or whatever, for lack of other words, or do you think there's still space for everything in the hobby?
I don't think there's space for everything in the hobby. I think that is kind of a weird path that we went down, is like suddenly you can buy an alligator and people are keeping 18-foot retics and berms, and it's not to say that people don't have the ability to do that. There's certainly people that can do a great job keeping large monitor species and whatnot, but it's also obvious that most people don't have the room for it. I mean, like, a monitor is such a huge animal. Unless you're in Florida and you can keep outside and you have the abilities to use the sunshine and create a ton of space, I think some of those huge species just doesn't make a lot of sense. And like you said, I love smaller species. In many ways, I regret the animals that I have because I got into the hobby with very little guidance. I mean, at that time, it was like, whatever you want, you should just go get. And I wanted a boa. And even though I understood that they get large, you don't know what that means when you don't own it. You don't know what that means for like down the road. You have an animal that could live like 40 years and it's going to be 8 feet long. Like, what are you going to do with that? So I could be so much more effective with my space if these enclosures were for smaller species. And maybe one day I'll work my way towards that. But at the same time, I feel like I have a responsibility for the animals that I do keep. And I I wouldn't say I would never move them along, because if I had a situation where maybe there was like a zoo or something that was like a sanctuary type situation where there was a huge enclosure available for something like that, maybe that would be a scenario where I would pass it along. But at the same time, you have an attachment to your animals and you want to make sure they're in good hands. But yes, to answer your question, I do think gravitating towards smaller species, I think, will be a crucial aspect for us moving forward. Even a bearded dragon is a large lizard. That's a really big animal compared to something like a Stenodactylus or like Latrodactylus. There's so many different animals that are quite small. You can get a lot of enjoyment out of keeping them. You can keep them in colonies and things like that allow the keeper to be more interested in it. And yeah, the welfare will just increase because of the amount that you can offer them without taking up a whole space of your home.
So let me ask you this. And this is a controversial topic that's constantly being like argued online as well in the hobby. What's your opinion on rehoming reptiles? Do you think that it's like once you get this animal, you're committed to it for life, or do you feel like, oh, I've worked with it for a while, I don't feel like this is for me, rehome it as long as it's to a good home? Like, where do you stand on that?
It's another tough one. I mean, we did a whole roundtable episode years ago now about the responsibility of getting an animal and what that means and how much work you should do beforehand to make sure you're getting the right species. And everything in that episode I really stand by. It was with a few other people. A lot of the comments in there were basically like, yeah, but you don't know, like, life situations change. You have to get rid of, like, now you guys are kind of making us feel bad for a life situation that now I have to, rehome an animal because of something that I didn't expect. So in hindsight, I thought, yeah, maybe that episode should have also included, there's absolutely times in your life where you may have to get rid of your animals where it actually makes sense to do so. And who knows what that could be. You don't want to be in a situation where you have to get rid of 30 animals and just kind of like take them to the lowest bidder or the highest bidder, I guess.
Yeah.
I think there shouldn't be a culture of, I want to just try this, and then if I don't like it, I should move on. You should really try your best to understand that species before you get it. And I know it's not going to work for everybody. And that's what's so important about having community around you. I mean, if you have lots of people who are in the hobby, there's probably a chance that one of your friends or one of your acquaintances would actually trade you or work with okay, you didn't like that species, why don't you pass it along to me? And you can know that it's going to end up in the right hands. Because at the end of the day, it's not really who the keeper is, it's how the animal is being kept. And if you can ensure that that animal that you purchased is going to go to a place where the welfare is going to be high, I don't think there's anything wrong about moving an animal along, but really it shouldn't be the first. It's kind of like our ripcord on our parachute. It's like instantly, like, let's just switch out. Like, I'm tired of this. Like, let's just refresh the whole collection to something new. That's clearly not a good thing. But I also can understand that there's times in your life where something's changed, and if the animals aren't moved along, their welfare is actually going to suffer because maybe you've lost your job or whatever it is, and you can't care for them as you did in the past.
Awesome, yeah. Awesome. So we'll start wrapping up on this then. What, if you were to leave people in the hobby with, advice, or we should do better on this, what would you say?
I think there's a few things. The first is really do your best to know your animal. So whether that's know the species that you are keeping or want to keep. If you're already keeping, then know that species. Know where it comes from. Know what its native habitat looks like, its climate, et cetera, et cetera. Also know your specific animal, right? Is there certain things that animal likes over other things? Like, as we already talked about, there's different personalities within the same species. Some animals are going to like a large water dish, some aren't. You want to try to accommodate what that animal enjoys, so you're actually giving it a higher quality of life. And the second, I think, the second thing is just this concept of, which I talk about a lot, is progressing your care. So really understanding that as we evolve in science, as you evolve as a keeper, as you acquire more money, for example, you could probably do better by each animal. And it's not to say that you're a terrible keeper for not having the state-of-the-art designed enclosure right now. It's just knowing that, when you have time and the money, you can actually make small adjustments and add things, or maybe expand the enclosure or change the lighting. There are different things that you can do to continue to improve the animal's care. And as I said earlier in the episode, that's actually a really fun way to interact with your hobby. You get that dopamine kick of making a change, and suddenly you come into your room and the enclosure looks different, and it gives you the whole room a different feel and a different vibe, and you see the animal working with the space differently. Those sort of things I think are really crucial. And then, as I said, if you can somehow get involved in conservation, whether that's just making sure you buy captive animals, but also maybe you can donate or find an organization that you think is doing the right things, you can even just promote that organization. That's a way that you can help that organization without having to donate to them. So I think those are 3 kind of good steps.
Yeah, that's incredible. And then one other thing, what's your opinion on we talked about optics earlier in the episode. What's your opinion on the optics of, or like the reptile hobby to the non-reptile hobby people? What are some things that we need to like avoid doing or do to kind of make ourselves look good to the rest of the world? Because I feel like that's important as well, right? Like you said, there's people who do want to shut us down. There are people who don't like that we keep reptiles. There's how do we stay looking good on the optics scale so that the outside world doesn't fight back harder?
I think having good, strong, healthy, robust animals in enclosures that look relatively like the place that they came from in nature, or have aspects of functionality that allow them to act as they would in nature, is a really good step forward. I can remember seeing a leopard gecko rack for the first time as a reptile keeper and being totally flabbergasted and confused. I wasn't like, that looks wrong. I was just like, is it really a gecko in each one of those little drawer things? And I think if you're a non-reptile keeper, that's quite a shocking thing. And it's such an easy way for those groups to attack us on, because there's so many things that they can pull from that aren't good. So I think just trying your best to care for your animals as well as you can in an enclosure that is clean, looks like it has a functional aspect to it so the animal can actually act natural, I think would go a long way to helping us. I mean, like optically, I mean, if you can show that your animal is acting naturally in its captive environment, that's key.
That awesome. Yeah, Dillon, thank you very much for doing this episode. Thank you very much for your incredible answers, and thank you very much for everything that you do for the hobby, man. I really do feel like you're a driving force for, putting the hobby on a better scale. Like I was just saying, optics wise for everyone else. So yeah, thank you for everything that you do, and thank you for coming on the podcast. Can you let everyone know where they can find you? Even though I'm assuming most people who ever listen to this probably already know where to find you, but let them know anyway.
Yes, absolutely. And first off, thank you for doing a show as well. I think any of these conversations I think are really important, and it's awesome to hear that you're into episode 70 now, and also another Canadian, which is fantastic. So
yes,
it was a pleasure to come on the show, and I was glad that we were able to finally lock it in. And it's always great to hang out with you in Toronto for the CRBE.
Yes.
As far as my stuff, if you just Google Animals at Home, you'll find me on YouTube, Instagram, or Facebook. I think Instagram is Animals at Home CA. But if you just go to animalsathome.ca or animalsathome.network.com, you'll find everything you need to know about the podcast. There's also other shows on the network that are fantastic as well. You can find that on the website, or just search Animals at Home on any podcasting app, Spotify, YouTube, and you'll find the show.
Yeah, and all of those links will be in the description. And the episode that Dillon mentioned a little while ago, the roundtable, I will also put that in the description. So go give that episode check that episode out as well, because I know that's where I'm going after this. But yes, awesome, Dillon. Thank you very much once again, and everyone, like I said, go give Dillon a follow. Thank you very much for listening to this episode. Stay tuned for more coming up.
Thanks, man.